This podcast was recorded on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation.
Hello and welcome to The Real Story with Joe Hildebrand. That's me. God, that sounds weird every single time. Absolute pleasure to have your company. We have got an absolute crackerjack episode for you. We've got reports that we could be going to the polls here in Australia just next month. Yes, next month we could be facing an election. Or we could not be facing an election. The UK has already just faced an election. It was an absolute bloodbath for the Tories. We'll get into some of the reasons and the background behind that. Of course, the French election as well. Was it rigged? How did it go from Marine Le Pen's far-right National Rally Party being the number one party to suddenly not even being able to hold power? And of course, Joe Biden, will he even make it to his election? All that and more, plus your answers to the questions that you've sent in. Thank you very much. And our very first special guest. That's all coming up right now. So first up this week, there was a story on the Daily Mail website by Peter Van Onselen, who is a very smart bloke, very well-connected bloke, pretty sensible political commentator and journalist. And he's a professor of politics, indeed. Professor PVO. And he set the cat amongst the pigeons with a piece that said basically that Albo, the Prime Minister, was planning to call an election for August 31st. That's an election next month, about 6 weeks away, which is probably earlier than anybody, even the so-called early election theory people have predicted that Labor will go to the polls. And it sounds kind of crazy, but Peter Van Onselen makes a pretty good case for it. Firstly, he says there's going to be an interest rate rise coming. It's probably going to be coming in August or September, more likely September. So you want to get the election out of the way before that rate rise comes and eats into everybody's tax cuts and energy rebates. And if there's an election campaign on, the RBA might be a bit shy in raising interest rates because it doesn't want to be seen to be getting political. Another tactical reason, of course, would be that it would sort of wrong foot or get the jump on this new Muslim vote movement, which is threatening the Albanese government in 4 or 5 really key Labor seats that are absolute dyed-in-the-wool Labor, safe as houses, but could potentially maybe be vulnerable to a protest vote on Palestine. So if the Albanese government goes early before those people have had a chance to get organised, get their ducks in a row, maybe you could sort of wrong foot them. And of course, this would get everyone voting at the time when they're getting that money from the tax cuts and they're getting that money from their energy rebate, that $300 off, which coincidentally happens to be roughly similar to the $275 that Anthony Albanese promised that every Australian's power bill would be reduced by 2025. But I'm not sure it's happening. And I'm not sure it's happening, firstly, because the one thing that happens whenever a story like this breaks is that every journal in the press gallery, every journal who has anything to do with politics will do one of two things. Firstly, they'll say, oh, that's bullshit because they didn't break it and it's not theirs. And so if it turns out to be true and they didn't get the story, then they look bad. So they'll do everything they can to poo-poo it. The other thing they'll do, of course, though, is hit the phones and call everyone they know to find out if it's actually true. And the thing with this story that was interesting about it was kind of the thing that wasn't that interesting about it, which is that it sort of sank without a trace. It didn't end up sort of creating this momentum where everyone was suddenly on standby, everyone's suddenly on tenterhooks, waiting for him to drive to Yarralumla and tell the GG to issue the writs and call the election. So that's one thing. And again, it didn't seem to cause much of a ripple, even among Labor circles themselves. A very well-connected Labor mate of mine that I spoke to, I said, so what did you think of PVO's article? And he goes, what? What one? So it wasn't exactly when there's an election coming, when everyone is getting set to go, word ripples around the Labor Party like wildfire. Everyone gets on a campaign footing and everyone is basically told, okay, get ready to go. They're about to fire the gun. It's going to happen. And of course, there was a leak of a memo that went around earlier this year from the head of the PM's office that suggested that there could be it was an election year. So again, maybe it is, but maybe not. And I think the smart money, or most of the smart money, is still on what I've been told, which is that the PM will go the distance insofar as things don't change. You never know. We could be invaded by aliens and the aliens say, hold an election on August 31st. Or, things change, people change. As J. Maynard Keynes said, when the circumstances change, I change my mind. What do you do? So, Anthony Albanese changed his mind about stage 3 tax cuts. Maybe he'll change his mind about going all the way and not having an election until the first half of next year and go early. But there's another reason why he just can't, or at least probably shouldn't go early this year. And that was revealed in a news poll that came out earlier this week. And it found that Labor is on the slide in a couple of key battleground states, and also that it's losing voters among the young and also among the kind of middle-aged. And the middle-aged roughly translates as sort of middle-aged, boring, mainstream suburban Australia. And they're the people you really got to keep on board. The young, you don't need to worry about. When you're young, you're stupid, you're radical. As Winston Churchill was supposed to have said, if you're not a socialist when you're 18, you have no heart. And if you're still a socialist when you're 50, you have no head. And I reckon that's about right. I was a crazy teen student socialist. I was an idiot. I did not know jack. I did not know anything about politics. I did not know anything about how the world worked. As I've found out, needless to say, I've become more mellow and I'm sharing everything I know with you right now. So those votes are going to go off to the left. Maybe they're angry about what the government's doing in Palestine. They'll go off to the Greens, but they'll always come back to Labor. Any vote that goes to the Greens is not going to then flow to the Liberal Party or the coalition before it comes back to Labor. And 80% or thereabouts of Greens votes all come back to Labor. So if it loses them in the first place, unless it's going head-to-head with the Greens in one of the seats in inner Brisbane or inner Melbourne, or indeed in Sydney maybe one day, unless it's going to one of those seats, which they've already lost, so there's not much left to lose, then those votes are going to come back to the Labor Party. It doesn't need to worry about the youngsters. What it does need to worry about, or who it does need to worry about, is those middle-aged, suburban, workaday hacks like myself, the people who schlep day in, day out, 40 hours, come back, they've got 2.3 kids, need to put food on the table, they've got a mortgage they're worried about, interest rates look like they're going up. If they are shifting away from you, that's where you've got a real problem. And they are shifting away from Labor, and that is a real problem. Now, in the two big states, the two most important states, arguably, the next election, New South Wales and Queensland. Now, the coalition is now ahead in New South Wales, 51-49, and that's a scary enough number. And this is basically based on all the news polls from April till about June. So about 3 months worth of news polls, they basically add them all together so they've got a statistically significant sample size, and then they can do those state-by-state breakdowns. So this is not about how people were feeling last week. It's an aggregate of how people were feeling across the last 3 months. So 51-49 in New South Wales, that's not great. 51-49 the coalition's way. In Queensland, that figure is 54-46. The coalition's way. Now, if that gets replicated, say even on a federal scale, if you have 53% is a landslide, 54% is a bloodbath. And in Queensland, of course, they've got a state election coming up towards the end of the year, October or November. It doesn't really matter when it is because the result's going to be exactly the same. Stephen Miles and Queensland Labor are going to be taken to the top paddock and slaughtered. They are going to be put down. They're going to be put out of their misery. It is all over Red Rover. And that's all well and good, whatever. That's democracy. Yay. Point being, voters in Queensland are so angry, so fed up that they're basically going to just kill the first MP they see. They're just waiting with brickbats and they're going to whack the first Labor MP they can get their hands on. And that means that if Labor goes to an election federally before Labor has had a chance to go to the state election, it means those federal Labor MPs, even though it's not their fault, even though they're federal, not state, it means that they will cop all that heat. So the conventional political wisdom is you let people go, take out all their anger on a state government, and once they're done all that, they go, oh, I feel better. And then you can go to the polls a few months down the track and people have got it out of their system. They're not angry at Labor anymore. And indeed, they've got a new Liberal government in Queensland to be angry at. And voters often vote for a bit of balance. A really important figure was Jeff Kennett getting in Victoria in a landslide. I think that was actually 54-46. So trust me, I know what a bloodbath looks like. He got in at the end of 1992. And everyone thought, oh, that's it. Labor in Victoria, dead in the water. No. The following year, in March, Paul Keating won the unwinnable election, the anti-GST election against John Hewson, and he actually won it by picking up seats in Victoria because people were so angry at Labor in 1992 that they voted them out in a massive, massive landslide, tsunami, and they got it all out of their system. And then they had Jeff, and they thought, okay, great. And then Jeff starts going crazy and doing all his stuff. Thinking, oh, well, we've got Jeff here. Maybe we better vote for a bit of balance federally. They did it in New South Wales as well, where they kept electing Bob Carr, John Howard, Bob Carr, John Howard, election after election. They kept voting one way on the state level and another way federally. So Anthony Albanese needs to hope that that is the kind of balance, that's the kind of fulcrum that will happen in Queensland. They'll be filthy at Labor on a state level. They'll get it all out of their system, and then they'll be happy enough to vote for him at the next federal election once they've got their LNP government in Brisbane. But if Labor goes to the polls on August the 31st, as has been suggested by the venerable PVO, then Anthony Albanese and not Stephen Miles could find themselves the punching bag for Queensland voters. And that's why I think he will still go the distance or still go to early next year. You heard it here first. If I'm wrong, forget you heard anything. Meanwhile, in America, the election campaign is being run by P.T. Barnum. It is amazing. It is a circus. It is like a Monty Python sketch combined with a surreal bad acid flashback from Pink Floyd's The Wall. It's just got absolutely everything in it. Now, we all know that Joe Biden's brain has taken a bit of a day off in lieu, or indeed a year off in lieu. It's just terrible. It's embarrassing. He's calling into breakfast TV shows randomly. It sounded like he was calling from the bathroom. You can almost hear his aides going, holy shit, we forgot about the phone in the toilet. Someone take it off him. They're refusing to answer questions about how many times a neurologist has visited the White House or whether or not Joe Biden has seen that neurologist or what's wrong with him. We all know the debate was an absolute fiasco. Donald Trump has now challenged Joe Biden to a debate without a moderator. He's also challenged him to a golf game. He's challenged him to a round of golf, and he says he'll give $1 million to charity. Like, it's madness. It's amazing. It's just an amazing show. Anyway, a couple of quick things I thought I would mention about this. One is that the prevailing wisdom these days is that Joe Biden has to go, while most Democrats are kind of, towing the party line. It's so obvious that he has to go. I mean, when he rang up MSNBC in the Morning Joe show, he started talking about these Democrats, these elite Democrats, they're out to get me. I mean, he sounded like Tucker Carlson. Like, you are an elite Democrat. The people who are out to get you, they're your own people. By the way, you got Whoopi Goldberg on The View saying she doesn't care if Joe Biden poops his pants. She's still going to vote for him. So Whoopi Goldberg, thanks for helping, Whoopi, has now raised the prospect of Joe Biden not being senile, but wearing an adult diaper. I'm pretty sure this is the point where your candidature becomes untenable. Anyway, so among those saying, look, Joe's just got to go, the prevailing wisdom seems to be that he hands it over to, wait for it, no, not Michelle Obama, which of course polls have shown is the only candidate who could safely or definitely beat Trump. No, it goes to Kamala Harris, who, depending on who you talk to, is the only candidate less popular than Joe Biden. So why is this happening? What is going on? Well, don't you just love campaign finances? The thing with Kamala Harris is she is the only person that the nomination can go to who can still get all the campaign money that's been donated. There is something like $250 million that's been donated to Joe Biden's campaign, that if he doesn't run, that money disappears unless it stays with the ticket. So the Democrats are in this horrible position where you've got the person, if they can persuade her, and Michelle Obama has said, I don't want to run, but you've got this person who is a clean skin, she's wildly popular, all the polling shows that she could beat Trump. It's a lay down misere, right? But she costs $250 million. You pick her, you say goodbye to all that money. And so it has to go to Kamala Harris, who at least can string a sentence together, and some people say are coming back. The other interesting tidbit about it is, how can you actually get rid of him? Well, the Democrats did put a clause into their primary processes in 2016 when there were question marks. And again, doesn't this take you back? Remember in 2016 when there were questions about Hillary Clinton's mental and physical capabilities? Oh, what we wouldn't give to have her back, huh? Anyway, they actually introduced a kind of, I don't know what you call it, a kill switch or whatever, where you could say, all right, even if she's got all the nominations or whatever and she's the presumptive candidate or whatever it goes to convention, if she's not of sound mind or body, you can say, all right. But apparently, I'm also told, it's not so much a kill switch as a suicide switch. The candidate has to actually be persuaded to tap the mat and drop out. And of course, the problem with having a candidate who's deranged is that the most sensible thing to do that everyone around them can see is the one thing they're not going to do because they're deranged. So it's a catch-22 times 2. Over to Europe now, and my God, if you thought America was cooked, Europe might just have days left to live. So what's happened? Well, we all know that in the European Union elections, the far right got this massive, massive influx of votes, this huge kind of tsunami of votes towards them that scared the bejesus out of everybody, and it made Emmanuel Macron exclaim, Mon Dieu, and rush to the polls and say, right, we're going to have our parliamentary elections in France right away. So you've got the president of France who kind of sits above, is directly elected by the French people. And then you've got the parliament elections, which has elects MPs to the Estates Générales. The recalling of the States General was, I think, what led to the French Revolution in 1789. So it's a high-risk proposition when you're doing this. And, of course, that produces their prime minister. So the president's responsible, is the head of state, responsible for most foreign policy and everything. The prime minister's responsible for most of the domestic stuff and, of course, all the MPs. Yada, yada, yada. You don't need to know all that. Point being, in the first vote for these parliamentary positions, Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party did incredibly well. It just absolutely smashed all the other parties around them. And so what did the government do? They were about to be overtaken by this enormously popular and populist right-wing, far right or hard right or populist right, whatever you want to call it, movement that's been threatening French politics from the edges for decades now. And it looked like it was actually they were going to be the prime minister. Their guy, very young, good-looking chap, was going to be the next prime minister of France. So what happened? Well, this is something you might call, I don't know, Fabian tactics or something. I don't know. It's kind of, it's almost like sort of throwing the fight to win the fight. So what Macron did is basically pull his centrist candidate. So he's got a centrist party called something like Renaissance or Renewal or some wanky kind of Frenchy name. He basically pulled his candidates from any seat where he thought they were splitting the left to centre left vote. And that was an awful lot of seats. I think something like 200 candidates might have been pulled or something. I may just be making that up, but whatever. And that meant that this weird sort of coalition, which I think is called the Popular Front, of all these just some normal people, but a lot of just terrible people like trots, commies, Marxists, radicals, Greens, you name it. Terrible people, but also some just normal left-wing people as well. That they were able to form this, well, they had just formed this coalition. It was formed almost overnight, literally just for this election, this kind of coalition called the Popular Front. And suddenly all the votes went into this one grab bag of crazies who are only probably marginally better than the crazy far right party and much less united. But they won. They beat the far right. They beat the National Rally Party and got more seats. They're not going to be able to form government because no one has actually got a majority. And so God knows who's going to be the next Prime Minister or how it's going to work. But a very interesting tactical maneuver from the French President Emmanuel Macron, who basically used his incredible weakness as a strength, albeit he delivered power to someone who was his enemy on the left, but it stopped him from ceding power to someone who was a greater enemy on the right. And that kind of tells you everything you need to know about politics. It's not about the best outcome, it's about the least worst. And now over to the UK, where Labor leader Keir Starmer, aka the greatest human being in the known universe, has taken the party not just from the evil clutches of Jeremy Corbyn, notorious trot, anti-Semite, you name it. He's been expelled for the party for the anti-Semitism that flourished and indeed was fueled under his watch. And Keir Starmer has taken the Labor Party back to the centre, and it has just paid off in spades, about 400 spades to be precise. Well, not spades, seats in the House of Representatives, House of Commons, I should say. They have commoners in the UK, not representatives. It's so cute. They also have lords, but that's another story. So Keir Starmer has won this massive majority, all but unprecedented, biggest majority in decades and decades and decades and decades. I think maybe even bigger than Tony Blair's. And the incredible thing is that he has done this. He's got about 2/3 of the seats in the House of Commons, and he's managed to do it with just 1/3 of the vote. So the UK has a first past the post system, unlike our preferential system. So firstly, voting is voluntary in the UK, and so you don't have to show up, and many people didn't. And also, if you drop out of a race, as you do in every single seat in Australia, if the lowest candidate drops out, the candidate who gets the fewest votes, their votes are then redistributed to all the other candidates. So your number, you vote 1 for the Animal Welfare Party or whatever, and then 2 for Labor. Animal Welfare drops out and 2 goes to Labor. Of course, you would have voted 2 for the Greens, but I don't want to get into the specifics of it. Anyway, point being, in the UK, that doesn't happen at all. It's just whoever gets the most votes. They don't even have to get, 50% or more of the votes in any given borough, which is their electorates. They just have to get more than anyone else. And as soon as that happens, they come in. And so if you've got a fractured electorate where no one likes politics or politicians and they're just fed up to the back teeth, which when you've had about 50 prime ministers in 49 days, as they have in the UK, is going to make you pretty fed up with politics. People are sort of, A, they're likely to just not show up to the election in the first place. And then B, they might vote for, new clean skin candidates, independents who say they're going to, shake things up or whatever. And that, neither the Tories nor Labor are any good. And that means that vote that the actual major parties get is much reduced. And so a lot of people are saying that, Keir Starmer didn't really lose the election so much as the Tories really badly lost it. Similar to what happened in Australia, where the vote against Scott Morrison and the coalition at the last election was massive, absolutely smashed. But when it came to reaping the dividends, Anthony Albanese didn't actually get that much. He only snuck over the line with a couple of seat majorities, thanks to a massive swing, a late swing from WA. It was really tooth and nail for a while. And he was on a really, low primary vote in the low 30s. So anyway, obviously everything comes back to Albo, but let's just go back to the UK for a second, and then we will actually come back to Albo, because it does come back to Albo. But point being, Keir Starmer and Labor have pulled off this massive coup where they've just beaten the other candidates and got more votes than them. But that's still only about 1/3 of voters. And they've come back with 2/3 of the seats in the House of Commons. And this has upset people who supported Nigel Farage's Reform UK party, because they're saying, hang on a minute, we've got 15% of the vote and you only got 30% of the vote. We should have half your seats, half the number of seats that you've got. Instead, they've got about, 5 at last count or something, nothing. And, tough titties, quite frankly. But that's because those votes are all spread all over the country quite evenly. That's a terrible thing in a first past the post system. If you want to win seats, you want to concentrate all your votes in the boroughs that they're going to actually count towards. There's no point having, 5% in every single borough, every single electorate in the country, and they all add up to a massive number if it's still 5% in every seat, and whoever gets say 30% in that seat is going to win. And so the Reform UK Party actually got more than the Liberal Democrats. Liberal Democrats only got about 10% of the vote compared to Reform UK's 15%. It's only 2/3 of the vote they got. But instead, they walk away with something like 40 seats because they've got established candidates and all their votes come from particular areas. So it's like, again, having a Greens MP in Australia winning a majority of votes in a seat like Melbourne or one of the inner city Brisbane seats. But of course, still the Greens only having about 10, 12% nationwide. So a little bit of a sort of explainer on why the Reform UK people are so upset and why they got 15% more than the Liberal Democrats, 10%. It's because politics, as John Howard said, is the simple art of arithmetic. And Reform UK's numbers simply don't add up. But as I said, all roads lead to Albo. And a lot of people were looking at the results in another 5 seats in the UK election where pro-Palestine candidates won against the major parties. Now, I'm not quite sure of the story that this really tells, but one of those seats at least was won by former Labor leader and Labor pariah Jeremy Corbyn, who quit the party and then ran against his old party. What a guy. And of course, he is just a ferociously trotty pro-Palestinian activist. And I think a couple of the other two were sort of Greens seats. So they had Greens who were very, very pro-Palestinian, but again, a sort of established party, albeit a kind of crazy fringe party. But anyway, this has brought home the question of what will happen in Australia. What will happen at the next federal election here with this Muslim vote movement, same name as the movement in the UK? Well, I've got a feeling it might not be quite all it's cracked up to be. There's a couple of things. One is that, like all religions, Islam is split along kind of sectarian lines. You've got Sunni Muslims, Shiite Muslims, and they don't really see eye to eye, a bit like Catholics and Protestants. Often you hate the people who are closer to you more than you hate the people who are of a different religion entirely. So again, if you've got a Muslim vote, is it a Sunni vote? Is it a Shiite vote? Would Sunni voters vote for a Shiite candidate? I don't know. Like, you look at what happens in other parts of the world. So would they vote for each other here in beautiful, peace-loving, multicultural Australia? We shall see. But I'm told that certainly there's a feeling among Labor that the threat might not be as real simply because there's internal division. There doesn't seem to be that much organisation around it either. Fatima Payman may be furiously working the phones or calling people, drawing up an election strategy, but we haven't quite seen it. So I'm not quite sure if that is going to happen. Of course, the other question is it just a Muslim vote thing, or is it a pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel vote thing? Therefore, would all these pro-Palestinian votes come out that weren't necessarily Muslim? Again, I don't think so. If you look at the white activist or non-Muslim activist pro-Palestinian camps, they're not in those suburbs of Western and Southwestern Sydney. Those are not working class people typically. They are usually middle class uni students, student socialists, whiter than the driven snow. You can see them camped outside Anthony Albanese's electorate office in Marrickville because they're the sort of places that they live. They live in the inner city. They live in the seats that vote Green or have very high Green votes. So, thinking Melbourne, Albo's own seat, Sydney, the inner city seats of Brisbane that have already fallen to the Greens. So again, I don't think those people necessarily, the pro-Palestinian votes that are in Western Sydney, I think are pro-Palestinian votes on the basis of those people being Muslim and having a strong affinity with Palestine as a concept, as a nation state, and possibly also with the region as well. I don't think it's just crazy, wild-eyed, noodle-armed activists who spend the rest of their days chaining themselves to trees. Now, our very first guest on The Real Story is someone who I think is worthy of that honour. He is a Labor elder statesman of the highest calibre. He is the former secretary, that is the big boss, the boss of bosses of the New South Wales Labor Council, and we'll find out why that's important in just a little while. Also a former senior vice president of the great all-powerful New South Wales branch of the Australian Labor Party. And he's also now the author of a book on Labor's very first Prime Minister. It's called In Search of John Christian Watson, Labor's first Prime Minister, and it's published by Connor Court. I strongly recommend you get yourself a copy. It's a fascinating insight into the very making of the Labor Party in Australia. And its author joins me right now, Michael Eason. Welcome to The Real Story. How are you?
Great to see you again, Joe.
Now, Michael, we've been talking a lot, and for some of us, I suppose, we never thought it would actually come to this, but there is talk at the moment about whether or not this 120 or 122, I think to be precise, year-old rule of the Labor Party, the binding caucus, that all Labor MPs are bound to vote the same way unless there's a conscience vote. And this was a rule that came into place, I think, in 1902 from memory, just a few years after the formation of the Labor Party itself. And the subject of your book, Chris Watson, is the very first Labor Prime Minister, and he had to contend with these sorts of pressures and demands in a very febrile environment. Talk us through John Christian Watson's first stint or only stint and very brief stint as Labor's first Prime Minister and the sort of forces he was dealing with in the Parliament.
Look, John Christian Watson was liked by everyone in the Parliament, and that's astonishing when you consider most politicians. He was liked by the Conservatives, he was liked by the different factions in the Labor Party. He was a unifier. Now, the Labor Party in its early period had a lot of people in favour of protection and a lot in favour of free trade.
That's right.
And so the party allowed a conscience vote on all of those issues and wanted to caucus the members of the Parliament on all other issues. And that became, I think, a bit more rigid after the split in the Labor Party in 1916. After John Christian Watson had left the Parliament, he left in 1910, but in 1916 conscription erupted.
Right. Billy Hughes,
lots of people, pretty well every significant figure but one in the New South Wales ministry left the party or was expelled.
And so you talked about the protectionists, the free traders. These were, of course, the two other major parties at the time. And there's a lovely line in your book, I think it's from Alfred Deakin, who says, this is a parliament of 311s. In other words, this is like playing a game of cricket, a test match with three sides instead of two, and one of the sides keep changing which side it's on. And John Christian Watson is in the middle of this, isn't he? So he's got...
He is. The first Prime Minister was Edmund Barton from New South Wales, a protectionist, then followed by Deakin. And as you mentioned, we roughly had a third in the Parliament, and Watson became Prime Minister for 113 days in 1904. And many people say that Deakin, who was a liberal, small L liberal Victorian protectionist, was tempted to form a coalition with Labor, as was Watson, but they didn't end up there. But you're right, the divisions in the Parliament ultimately meant that the 311 became 211 and Labor became the dominant opposition party and then the government.
So this is the birth of the two-party system, basically.
It really was.
And the reason why I wanted to talk to you and talk about this now is we're seeing possibly the beginnings of the fracturing of that system. Not quite yet in the Parliament, although we may be heading towards minority government and probably are. But in the electorate, we are seeing now a shift away from where just a couple of decades ago, each of the major parties, the Coalition and Labor, would get over 40% of the primary vote each, and the rest would be sort of distributed among the minor parties and then come back. Now we're looking at a system in the electorate, at least, where the vote is very much about a third for the Coalition, about a third for Labor, and about a third for other minor parties. Do you think that the two-party system is fracturing now?
I do think that's a very good point, and we're seeing the emergence of the 311. But Liberal and Labor are much stronger than those parties bunched in the middle, and those parties are very much divided. I think it's interesting with Senator Payman that she never pressed the point about having a conscience vote on some issues. And I'm very disappointed that she stuck to the position she did, especially given the Labor Party in the Senate was proposing resolutions in favour of recognising Palestine as part of a two-state solution. But instead of saying, can I have a bit of freedom and flexibility, she actually baited people and decided, I think, months ago to walk out.
That's right. It actually seems, and this is why people who perhaps haven't given much attention to this issue but just sort of see the headlines think, oh, she's just being punished for speaking her mind. In fact, this is not something she ever brought to the Labor Party caucus and said, I feel really strongly about this. If it comes to this, I'm going to cross the floor. It was not as though Labor didn't give her an option to vote for recognising Palestine. It just came in a motion that also recognised Israel. And of course, before and after this, she'd released multiple statements saying that she opposed the party's position, that she would do what she did again. It does seem to be a deliberate sort of campaign of provocation, like, sack me from the party, expel me, I dare you.
I think that's exactly right. And she didn't raise it in the full caucus meeting. All of the Labor members of Parliament in the House of Reps and the Senate. And then there was the second meeting of all of the Labor senators, and she's sitting mute, not saying a word.
Yeah,
so I lost respect for her over that.
So talk us through, some people have said, look, this binding caucus rule is anachronistic, it's archaic, it has no place in the modern Labor Party. What is your view? Do you think it is still important, and why?
I'm in a minority in that I think the British system has a lot to commend itself. And in Britain, they have Labor whips and Conservative whips, which mean these are the people who are supposed to whip everybody into line. And there's a one-line whip, a two-line whip, a three-line whip. A one-line whip is, if you're in the Parliament, can you vote this way, please? But if you don't want to, no problem. Two-line whip is, please turn up and give us an excuse if you can't, and you can't vote this way. Three-line whip, I want you to vote this way no matter what. And I think there's a lot of merit in that British system. I think this would have been a three-line whip. And most people in the Labor Party make the point that the great reforming period of Australia was under the Hawke-Keating government.
Yep.
And if we gave people a conscience vote on everything, we would not have had the economic reform that changed Australia in the 1980s and early 1990s. So that's a good argument for the current system.
So a sort of traffic light system where there are some issues that are top tier, yes, you must hold the line. Others, we really want you to, but if you suddenly get sick or you have to abstain or you're not present, okay. And then another one, which there is provision for in the Labor Party, you can, if it matters of conscience, a conscience vote can apply to things of, religious faith sometimes or
exactly right. And that's a great summary
sometimes.
Of the point.
I love what you said about the whip. I was just going to bring up this line that someone sent from a UK whip. It was in an article in The Spectator last month. And the whip has this advice for people trying to maintain party unity. Single somebody out from among the troublemakers. It doesn't matter who. It can be quite random, but preferably without an organised gang of their own. Pick on something they've said or done as your causus belli, your cause for war. Again, anything plausible will do. Then come down on them like a ton of bricks, and very publicly. MPs are pack animals. They'll see the fate of their colleague and run the other way. So go early, go hard, and don't leave your victim standing.
That's a great quote. I might re-originate that.
I said to the person who said it to me, that almost brought a tear to my eye. It was so beautiful. Yeah. How do you see, obviously there's a lot of talk about how the next election's going to go and why. What do you see the impact of this new Muslim vote movement being, particularly in southwest and western Sydney? And do you think the government is inevitably headed towards minority?
Look, I don't know. I think the public don't want a minority government, and so that will play well for both the Liberal and the Labor Party. It's the two parties who could form a majority government. I don't think the Muslim vote organisation will succeed. And they're getting a lot of noise, and there's been reference in the media about 5 MPs in the UK winning on the issue of Palestine and Gaza from heavily Muslim electorates in the UK. They're much more heavily Muslim than any of the seats in Western Sydney.
Right.
The most concentrated is Blackland, Paul Keating's former seat. I think ordinary people who are Muslim background are like everyone else. They want to get ahead. They count education, Medicare is very important. Who's going to look after and promote the interest of their kids? I don't think people are going to narrowly vote just simply on this issue. And I think it disrespects the Muslim vote, so-called, because there are Pakistanis, there are people from the Lebanon, there are people from many different countries who we're privileged to live amongst as part of Muslim Australia.
Absolutely. And of course, there's the division between Sunni and Shiite Muslims and questions over whether Shiite Muslims would vote for a Sunni candidate or vice versa. And as you say, I think the highest proportion of Muslim voters in any of these electorates ranges from about 20 to about 30 or tick over 33%. So about a third at the upper end. So every single one of those Muslim voters would have to vote for that candidate, and even then you still wouldn't have a majority, and so then you would be looking for preferences from whom. You can't imagine the Liberals would be preferencing them. You can't imagine they would preference the Liberals over Labor. So, because...
I agree. I think it's exaggerated, but it's a lot of noise, and people are finding the noise interesting.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about, and again, it ties in very strongly with your biography of Chris Watson, because above all, and I think this is really important for the first Labor Prime Minister, he was a quintessential pragmatist. As you say, he got along with other people. He was not militant. He was not an ideologue. He worked with people as much as he could. He made compromises. He listened to opposing arguments. We've seen, I suppose, in, say, for example, the latest news poll we saw where Labor is losing votes among the middle classes or the middle-aged people who are often middle class like me. It's now behind in New South Wales and even more behind in Queensland. Is Labor sufficiently targeting, I suppose, the political centre and I guess mainstream Australia and just sort of mainstream Australia's sort of natural sort of instincts enough, do you think?
No, I don't. I think the government has been pretty good. Certainly it's better than their predecessor government, the Morrison government. But I think they've not played politics as well as they could have. They've been into governing rather than politics. And I don't think Albanese wakes up every day thinking, how can I win the news cycle this day? You don't feel that about this government. And I think that's the right approach to govern for the best interests of everyone. But I think the government has been complacent and not getting its message across.
Is it fair to say, I think the Australian public is not, generally speaking, ideologically minded. We seem, I think, a very earthy, practical people, and we reward governments that provide sort of practical, understandable, relatable and sort of hard hip pocket solutions rather than big picture things. We tend not to reward what I think Paul Keating called the vision thing. So The Voice, there was punishment over that. I think there's in principle support for action on climate change, but not at the expense of higher bills or more unreliable power. And I think maybe those two things I think perhaps a bit unfairly, because the government has done a lot of really good practical stuff, but just sort of thinking about The Voice, thinking about climate change, people think, well, hang on, are they more concerned with these ideological pursuits than my kind of desperation, my economic desperation in the here and now? Are you sensing that, or am I just making that up?
Every government has to ensure the public feels that they're on their side, that they're listening, that they're pragmatic, and they're making a difference to ordinary people's life. What's interesting about John Christian Watson is that he was the first Labor Prime Minister in any country. So in 1904, Australia led the world.
Yep.
And I think we can draw some lessons from that, which is why I'm proud that the Prime Minister will launch the book.
That's fantastic. And indeed, as I say, I love the PM, and I think he is, as someone who's originally a creature from the left, I think he is really pulling out all stops to be more centrist, to place himself very firmly at the centre of the political spectrum. Finally, the million-dollar question: when do you think the election will be called at this stage, and what do you think? And again, they say it's always dangerous to make predictions in politics, especially about the future. But when do you think the election will be called, and how do you think the government's going to go?
I've no idea, but I know in the UK a lot of people have been arrested for betting on the election date, and I don't want to be accused of having any insider knowledge just in case I fluke an accurate prediction. But I suspect it might be at the end of this year or early next year. That's my guess. I think so long as Peter Dutton holds Queensland, he's competitive.
Yeah.
But I think he's not going to win votes amongst the teal seats.
That's right.
And I think a lot of his policies are taking a gamble, such as nuclear. And so I think Labor's in a very good position.
Michael Eason, Labor elder statesman, big brain extraordinaire, and now author of In Search of John Christian Watson, Labor's first Prime Minister. Fantastic book. Get it wherever you get your books from. Thank you so much for joining us on The Real Story.
Thank you, Joe.
And now to what is my favourite part of the show, even though we've only had it for a couple of weeks, and that is when I get your questions to me and you ask them, I answer them. I pretend I'm right, you pretend I'm right, and if you find out that I'm wrong, just don't tell a soul. Anyway, Paul Jenkins has gotten in touch. He says, love your work, mate. Thank you very much. Love yours. My question, can you see a day in the future where Labor and Liberal bite the bullet and hand their preferences to each other? Or are both way too scared to blink first? Paul, that is an absolute cracker of a question, is $1 million question. And again, if you look at what's happening or what might be happening in southwestern Sydney with this Muslim vote group, what happens there? I'm actually much more worried about a different local independent candidate, such as Frank Carbone, who's already signalled that he might be running in one of those seats, coming in with all their sort of local grassroots support, separate from religion or separate from a foreign conflict. Now, what would happen there? In that case, of course, the Liberals would all preference that independent, as they did with Di Lee, who ran against Christina Keneally in Fowler. Again, another very, very, very safe Labor seat that fell like a house of cards. And that would get someone like Frank Carbone or another independent in his kind of sphere of influence over the line. What happens with the Muslim vote? Well, you would have to be pretty sure that they would not preference the Liberal Party over the Labor Party, because the Liberal Party has an even more pro-Israel stance than the Labor Party does. It's been even more unequivocal. So it wouldn't make much sense for them to send their preferences that way. And the Liberals couldn't in good conscience preference the Muslim vote over the Labor Party. Their base would absolutely hate that. And of course, it would be incredibly hypocritical given their stance on the Israel-Palestine conflict. So in that case, you may well see a situation where Liberal preferences could go, or at least Liberal voter preferences, whether it's on the how to vote card or not, but Liberal preferences could go to Labor before they go to a candidate from this Muslim vote party. And again, there's been precedent in the past where both major parties have put one nation last, which is another way of saying that they're preferencing each other rather than a common threat or a party that's so extreme that it's unpalatable to any mainstream party. That has happened. And again, I would like to see, and I think inevitably it will have to happen, where Liberal and Labor preference each other in seats where Labor is under threat from the Greens. And I believe from memory that the Liberal preferences actually went to Adam Bant in Melbourne the first time he won that seat. And that's basically how he ended up in Parliament. And I don't think the Liberals are pretty happy with that result. Although maybe they think that, the Greens are such a bad look for the left that they're quite happy for them to go along, because certainly Labor can never form a coalition with them ever again. So in a way, they've kind of done it before. And in a way, it makes perfect sense if they are, under threat. Say they did a deal where the Libs preference Labor in seats where Labor was under threat from the Greens, and Labor preference Libs in seats where a moderate Liberal candidate was under threat from the Teals. So I can very much see that happening. Whether it will happen or how far off it is hard to say. But there's little shoots where it's kind of happened before, or where it would make sense in both parties' interests for that to happen. And in politics, as they say, always back self-interest, because it's the only horse that's really trying. And that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for listening to The Real Story. If you love what you hear, leave a rating and a review. If you hate what you hear, don't tell anybody. If you want us to cover anything on the pod, reach out. I love getting all your emails and your messages via therealstory@novapodcasts.com.au or via my DMs on IG. That's Instagram for all you boomers out there. My handle is @Joe_Hildebrand. And if you want to hear more or read more about what I think about anything, you can check out my columns in the Daily Telegraph every Monday and every Saturday. You can't miss it. In the meantime, See you next week.